I'm not quite sure how to begin this because I find this experience quite over. It's gratitude, obviously, towards the people, not just who have spoken, but people they represent, towards most of you who are here, whom I know personally. And it's also embarrassing. I mean, it really is. To sit there and have people talk about what you've written, that's embarrassing enough. But such wonderful things that you've said. It's embarrassing in part because, here's a secret. Maybe it's not a secret. It's probably one shared by most academics. I've never thought I was particularly very good at what I did. And I mean that sincerely. I've thought of myself as a third-rate theologian. And there are reasons for that. I got to it late. I didn't enter my doctoral program until I was over 30. I didn't have the languages in place. I probably should have, at least to the degree I should have. I didn't learn, if you go to graduate school after you're 20, when you're 24, after you're undergraduate, you learn a discipline when you're still able to learn it, of looking at texts and in my case, including manuscripts and libraries. And so I never really got that either. So I always felt like a little bit of a dilettante. I knew a little of this, a little of that. And, it's nice to be told that that's, representative of your capacious intellect and so on. But it's from my point of view, it's because I never got very deep in anything because I didn't have the skills. I'm just saying, so I hear these things. And by the way, I'm not just trying to make some personal comments. This is actually going somewhere. It's embarrassing because I'm not sure it's true, but I'll accept that. One of the things, 50 years ago, I began undergraduates, literally 50 years ago. I went into my undergraduate program. I thought I was going to be maybe a musician, study music. And here, almost exactly 50 years later, I stand. And it's nothing. There isn't a single thing that has anything to do with my expectations of 50 years ago. Not just wonderful students and colleagues and friends, a spouse who gets up and talks about you in a way that's much better than a eulogy at a funeral because I get to hear it. But who would have thought? I mean, who? I didn't think any of this is possible. It was not in my imagination that I would get married, that I'd have children, that I'd be ordained, that I'd go work in Africa, that I'd end up moving, and then ending up being the subject of a conference on theology and scripture. I believed in God. I was a Christian when I went to university at age 17, but I didn't know a thing about what any of that meant. And to think that, now people are interested in something I wrote about this. So one's life doesn't go anyhow or way you think it's going to go. I'm moving into some theology. In my recent book, I spent a lot of time talking about the nature of time as being catastrophic, which sounds bad, and it often is bad. But the word itself simply means upending, being turned over. From the point of view of the book I wrote, which was sort of focusing on the question of politics, the catastrophic nature of time, meaning that everything is always getting upended all the time, means that you can't ever really plan. Strategies and policies never get you very far. There's always something that's going to ruin it, even if you're good at what you do. Pandemics, earthquakes, hurricanes, assassinations, wars, what have you. That's on a big front. The little front, as it were, you know, the call that your child just got hit by a car, God forbid, you get cancer or whatever, you lose your job. You can't plan for anything. You can try, and it's not a bad thing to try. But the nature of our lives and of time itself is that it's always being upended. That's what catastrophe means. Now, we tend to think of catastrophe as bad. Those are the pandemics and the hurricanes and the terrible things. But it's also good. It's my standing here at age 67 after 50 years having entered knowing nothing, undergraduate, thinking maybe I'd end up playing the violin. Lucky for the musical world, that didn't happen. But Scripture is the great treasury of catastrophic grace. It gives us everything that makes up our lives, which are catastrophic. There are just constantly new things happening that we can't expect. But it's grace, because that's what builds who we are. People have made allusions, difficult things in my life, probably no more difficult than most of you here, but nonetheless difficult enough. And that's true. There are a lot of things in my life I'd trade. But taken together, it's who I am, and who I am has been given by God in these totally unexpected ways, which are grace. That's just a wonderful, wonderful reality. I want to witness to that. So, somebody can get up here and talk and thank you and whatever, but I want to say more than that. I want to say that I can do that, and people say this understandably, but often glibly, because of the grace of God. And because of the grace of God, in turning everything that I would have expected to be something else into this. It's amazing to me. It's just amazing. It's amazing for every one of us. I want to make a remark about the Yale School. And it's related to this a little bit. There are lots of different kinds of theology. I would divide theology in basically two kinds. The first kind is the main kind, doctrinal theology. And I mean that in a broad way. Theology that is interested in what we believe, laying it out, making it clear, ultimately teaching it. And that could be dogmatic theology, systematic theology, but it's also political theology. The political theology is the epitome of telling people what they should do and trying to make them do it, or ethics and so on and so forth. That's the main kind of theology, with all its variations. What to teach, what the truth is in that sense. But there are times when that becomes difficult because of catastrophe. I think it would be fascinating to write a whole history of theology that was structured around the catastrophes that gave rise to a particular school or person or set of interests. There are similarities, but lots of differences based on the kinds of catastrophes taking place. Augustine was writing in a catastrophic moment. Obviously, at various points, or John of Damascus, or Maximus the Confessor in the East with Islam, another set of catastrophic moments. Obviously, we all know about the Reformation in the 16th century and so on. There are lots of these different catastrophic moments that have taken place in history, and the theology that comes out of it doctrinally changes, it shifts in response to these different things. The 60s provided a very peculiar catastrophe. And I'm using this broadly. And that was that there wasn't anything to teach left. And that's where the Yale School arose. It was a catastrophic theology. What do you do when nobody knows what the Bible is or who is God? Death of God was all over the place in the United States at the time. Ben McDonald, are you here, Ben? You wrote about that, and so on and so forth. Churches were pointless to many people. It's not like it's changed a lot since then, but that was new. And so the theology that folks at Yale were doing were like everybody was doing in the past. It was a response to this, but it was a particular kind of catastrophe. It was about the foundations of God and belief in God, which wasn't really ever the case before within the history of the Christian church's catastrophic theologies. So you had this turn amongst people at Yale. They were doing it elsewhere too, but for various reasons, there was a commonality the way they did it, trying to get at the foundations. So Joe talked about reparative theology. I'd go further. It was a sort of resecuring of the whole thing. Not just repairing it, but trying to make sure it didn't disappear and get washed away in the tides of the culture. And so, even if The Nature of Doctrine by George Limbeck wasn't his most deepest important work, the very title tells you what he was about. He was looking for the foundations. What does it mean even to teach about the faith to anybody? How do you get people to do that? And Hans Frey talking about the character of how it means to communicate scripturally. And you could see that with other folks there, David Kelsey as well, and so on. So there was this attempt to secure things for the sake of doctrinal theology. So that's why it was very traditional in many ways. And the folks who were teaching were committed. However odd they may seem to other people, they were committed to the traditional, basically, faith of the church. But they were doing it from this position of having to get underneath it to show how we could have that faith at all. So what Yale did, which I think was different because of this moment of sort of foundational concerns, it ended up exposing the faith or theology to deeper questions, frankly, than most of the history of theology, not all of it, has engaged. It was mediating towards another kind of theology, which I would call, I'm just making this up, I don't know, theology of the mystery of God. Which is interesting, Eberhard Jungel's concern with this was coming out of the same period and some of this stuff. Theology of the mystery, that is to say, who is the God who is behind all of this? What's he like? What's he doing to us? You could call it more existential, you could call it more, but it wasn't really about my experience. It was about what God is doing in the world. We have a world. Is there a God? What is God doing? And it's not that moving into a sort of theology of the mystery of God is not Christian, but it's asking the Christian questions in a kind of non-organized way, because you're not teaching, you're trying to see God and describe who God is. So it's a very different place from which to do theology. I am interested, who mentioned, was it Brad or you, Joe, or somebody, about somebody I should be connected with, Pascal. Pascal was one of these theologians of the mystery of God, very much so. So was Augustine in some of his writing, not just the Confessions, City of God, and so on. It's not like these sort of doctrinal theology of the mystery of God and sort of this mediating thing only happen once and in one place at one time and one person. Everybody, the lines are blurred, but nonetheless, there are particular moments and so on. I ended up going there. That's where Yale pushed me. So I wanted to say, and to clarify my place in the Yale School, I didn't go back, having sort of engaged the securing of doctrinal foundations to try to articulate doctrine in the same way. I ended up being pushed to that other side of this mediating position of trying to understand who God is in this world, which is so hard to figure out. It isn't without doctrinal, not just implications, but content. So anyway, that's just to try to say a little something about how I see my place in that. But I do think that one of the realities is that understanding, and here is something I wanted to just respond briefly, if I might, Brad, to a couple questions you asked at the end. Um, my concerns with figural reading and so on are in the end, and not just, and it's been said by folks here, so it's not that I'm correcting anybody, but I'm just adding to this, are in the end not driven by a desire to get my hermeneutics of scripture straight, or the way all these things fit together. They're driven by a sense that we as human beings have very little purchase from which to understand God. And what we have been given is all God's gift. And it's those two things together. We have very little purchase. We are limited creatures. So my whole interest as it grew up about mortality over the last 10 years comes from that. This sense of trying to figure out who God is and how he's talking to us, given that we are so little and limited. That's a very Pascalian theme, I realize. We die. We don't know most people in the world. We know hardly anything about the past. We lose everything we love, inevitably, sometimes sooner rather than later. We get gifts, but we don't know what to do with them, and so on and so forth. So mortality frames very much, as I've been trying to understand, the kind of what might appear as a totalizing of Scripture, which could lead to a kind of bibliolatry that maybe David was worried a little bit about. The Scripture becomes the everything of the world. It's not that. God is the everything of the world. And it's not because we have no freedom or we don't have any agency or there's no space for us in this world. It's that we cannot understand what that space and freedom is. We simply cannot understand it and know what to do with it without God providing everything to us to allow that to make any sense to us. So the competitive, non-competitive character, that's a fair question, except I think from my point of view, it's beside the point. That is to say, we live as creatures who are not in competition with God. We know that. And we might try to be, but the message is very quickly drilled home to us that we are not. And so that's a category that doesn't so much come into play for me. It can under certain, within certain discourses and problems and so on, and rightly so. We have responsibilities. We make choices. These are things that God asks of us and so on. But what those responsibilities and choices are not things we create. And we have no control over where they end up. I would stick with the kind of totalizing character of Scripture's gifting. As I said, Scripture is this treasury, infinite treasury of catastrophic grace. We see our whole lives in it. They're given to us, but they're given to us as given, not as self-created. And receiving it is so hard. I'm standing here, the receptor of gifts I never expected, could have predicted, could have imagined and confected myself. And with all of that together, I can't claim it makes all kinds of sense in the world for me, but it makes all kinds of grace for me. That's what it is. And my attempt and my responsibility and my calling to make sense of it is to receive more and more of the sense that is given by God to my life in Scripture. And I'll stop there. I'm so grateful. That's all I can say. And I thank all of you and thank all of you.